Hello, folks. Welcome to our second virtual lesson of the year in Social Studies 7. It is appropriately the 7 Years' War. So the 7 Years' War took place in the 1750s. And specifically, you're wondering that, 1755 to 1763. So a little bit more than 7 years between the French and the British. And so this war was fought not just in North America, but you could argue it was one of the very first world wars. It was also in North and South America, in India as well, and West Africa. Britain and France also had a whole bunch of allies in the picture too. And so at this point, the British, even though they had way more people in North America, if you check out the map on that PowerPoint, you'll see that they were starting to be hemmed in by a bunch of French forts. So they were very concerned, as well as from attacks by France's indigenous allies, because most of the First Nations were allied with the French. They were concerned that this would limit their growth on the continent. Britain, their population was just booming, and this led to a lot of confrontations with the First Nations, including in Newfoundland. Beothuk people were completely wiped out. So you'll actually see there's a slide where it features Shanawdithit, who was the last full-blooded Beothuk woman, and she died of tuberculosis in 1829. So the British essentially wiped out this entire people. And part of it was from disease for sure, but also there were conflicts with the foresting industry, the fur traders and hunters, and sometimes they actually even put bounties for every Beothuk that someone could kill. They would actually get money from the government. So a really, really brutal way of dealing with those people. And so going into this battle, as we know, France was at a clear disadvantage. They did not have the population to sustain a big war on North America, but they had all the power on land. And so if you take a look, if we call this France, so France, they had a lot of power on land, and we call this Britain, there was going to be a massive showdown indeed. And so the plan for France was just to hold on. If their colony could hold on long enough, because when it came to French colonial power, so this was on the mainland, but French power in North America was more like this binder clip, right? So all of a sudden, Britain's not so imposing, right? So they were hoping that they could win in Europe, that they would do well in Europe, capture a bunch of land from Britain and its allies, and or other places like in India, and then trade that back for any overseas possession it lost. Britain's big advantage was the Navy. It had amazing ships, like this ship right here, could sail the 7 seas. This made it very tough for France to sustain its colonies, whether it was India, North America, or Africa, anywhere, because the British could basically send a bunch of ships and sink the French ships, sink their reinforcements. So it was pretty much holding out and hoping for the best with France. So as far as it went, there were a couple of key generals who were involved in these campaigns. And for the French, one of their key generals was Montcalm. And so he was a marquis, and he was a very influential fellow in terms of traditional European style combat. So they would pretty much march and shoot. I would recommend that you actually download the PowerPoint and check out the video for the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, because you'll see it seems kind of silly. They're basically walking right up to each other and shooting in straight lines. But part of that was because their guns were so inaccurate that the only way they could realistically hit consistently their targets was to get pretty close and to shoot in a big line. Sometimes it might seem like, oh, gee, shouldn't they shoot from further back? But no, they would have missed most of those bullets. So Montcalm, he actually adopted some of the First Nations style of combat. So he there was kind of like guerrilla warfare. So you're doing hit and run. So you're kind of picking them off from the trees. And he was able to actually win some victories against the much larger British army in this way. However, it was really only a matter of time until the British proved victorious, particularly with their control of the seas and their superior numbers. So eventually they kept on pushing the French more and more into Quebec. The British general, his name was James Wolfe. And so, he was actually quite young, one of the youngest generals that the British had. And ultimately in this battle of Quebec and the Plains of Abraham, the video goes over the details, but there were several mistakes made by the French. They kind of underestimated the English ability to scamper up the hills very quickly to these plains. In the battle itself, both generals, Montcalm and Wolfe, were mortally wounded. So that meant they both died. So you take a look at them both, get a good last look, and boom, oh, they're dead. It was very tragic. Rest in peace. I hope the graphic violence didn't disturb you too much. If it did, well, maybe you need a comfort support pillow, right? So in any case, the French were defeated. Quebec was lost. There were some rebels who managed to actually retake Montreal. The Canadiens, they were called, the French Canadians, but they eventually Montreal was retaken as well. And now some people say, oh, well, what would have happened if it had been different? What if Montcalm had won the Battle of the Plains of Abraham? Well, honestly, I think it's kind of a silly question, because even if they had won that battle, they were still losing the war. This was pretty much like they were on the edge of defeat. So yeah, that would have delayed the inevitable for a little bit longer. But no, there was no way that they were going to win. In Europe, meanwhile, over in Europe, they had the big cheese, all this power in Europe. And unfortunately, though, for the French, it was a stalemate. So basically, they didn't. Oh, a feather went flying. Oh, dear. They didn't really capture anything in Europe that they could trade to regain their colonies. So now the British were in full control of the North American continent, pretty much, as far as New France went. However, you might think that they were all happy and that they were delighted, but no, they weren't. Because just like we saw how when the French were the big dog, that everyone kind of gathered up to take them down, so too the British had suffered a lot. And they actually had gone bankrupt. They had spent enormous amounts of money. One of the reasons they were able to actually fight the French really effectively is because they invented the national debt. They said, we're basically going to borrow a whole bunch of money so we can spend more than we have. So that was all great until it came time to pay up. And now it was time to pay up. The war was over. Not only that, but being all short of money, they were now in control of tens of thousands of French and Indigenous people that they had just defeated, who were not too happy to be living under British rule. So they were going to have to figure out a way to keep these people from being happy and not rebelling against them. So really, it was a kind of a Pyrrhic victory, you could almost say, or let's say, not a Pyrrhic victory, a poisoned chalice of victory. That it was what they wanted to win the war, but it was not really a very glamorous prize that they won in New France. It brought them a lot more trouble. So we are going to now. Normally, we would be doing a simulation, a strategic simulation. You would get to take on the role of the British, the French, and some of their First Nations allies. But we're not going to do that for now. We might actually do that when you get back, because that's actually one of my flagship simulations, and it would be a real shame for you to miss that. In fact, I would bring dishonor and disgrace to everything in which I believe if we didn't do that. But yeah, so we're not going to worry about that for now. So yeah, this week you don't have to really worry about any new assignments. Just make sure that if you did not finish the persuasive essay, that you get that into me. Okay, so A Tragic Tale, Wolfe and Montcalm. You know, they say that in war, the only winners are the vultures. And in this case, certainly it was true. So we'll see what happened to the newly subjugated people of New France next time. Until then, au revoir. Ha ha ha.